There we go. Okay. Supporting social work interns through competency-based goal setting. So our learning objectives today, we're going to spend a little bit of time just reviewing the social work competencies and practice behaviors. We are going to go over kind of responsibilities and strategies that a supervisor can use to support and nurture goal setting process. We're going to develop some techniques to guide students in setting these clear, achievable, meaningful goals. And then we'll also do a little bit of kind of logistical, like looking at what is the WVU School of Social Work learning contract process, so you have a clear understanding of that. So first, I like to put this in context that field education is designated by our Council on Social Work Education as the signature pedagogy, equal in standing to all of our coursework. And the learning contract is really kind of the key tool here. So field education is meant to help our students connect the theoretical things that we're teaching them in the classroom with what it looks like in reality in real settings. And the learning contract is really almost kind of like a translation tool. That is how they're going to kind of see the language of those social work competencies and translate that to practice behaviors that they're going to do so that they can really get better at that intentionality. They might be doing a lot of things, but do they understand when they're doing different, engaging in different practices in your setting, what exactly that is in terms of social work competencies and how that fits. And so that's, again, part of the purpose of the learning contract is to kind of help make that transition. So again, this is a really important document. I was just saying yesterday, I feel like when I talk about the learning contract, I'm always kind of trying to sell it as something that's really valuable. Some people are buying what I'm selling and some people are not, but this is really kind of the framework of our pedagogy here. Also in context, the CSWE adopted a few years back competency-based framework. So it wasn't always like this, depending on, when you went to school. If you were a social worker, there have always been, these overarching frameworks, but it wasn't always this competency-based. I think this has been around for a little while, but this is kind of what we're working with now. So really looking at that competency-based, our social work competence is looking really at kind of the ability to integrate and apply our social work knowledge, values, skills to practice situations. So can our students apply and integrate what we're teaching them in ways that fit into your settings, in ways that are culturally responsive, in ways that are purposeful, in ways that are intentional and professional? And so really being able to do that and think about it and do that intentionally. And that's part of what that competency is. And so again, this educational approach is really focusing on the outcomes that the students are going to demonstrate through action. And we'll talk a lot through this training about this kind of competency piece, because as the students are setting their goals, we really want to emphasize that it's not so much that they're setting goals so that they're making kind of a checklist of activities to complete, but we really want to create these opportunities for them to practice and develop competence so that they can do these things and that by the time they graduate, they are ready to go out as competent professionals. So again, really looking at the purpose of the learning contract. So, in its simplest form, this is an agreed upon plan. It's going to help the students connect their own goals, your agency's needs, and the learning requirements. So really kind of looking at those three purposes here. The student is bringing something, the agency is a setting, and we as an educational institution, we have things that we need them to do. And so the learning contract is a place where everyone can kind of get on the same page with how do those things connect. It ensures that everybody is in agreement about these goals for the placement so that we have a clear, path going forward, what this internship is and isn't going to look like. It ensures, this is kind of from the school side of things, it ensures that the student does have practice experience, practice opportunities for all 9 competencies that we need them to do. It also develops this clear plan of action for evaluation. So I'll kind of talk about how the learning contract leads into evaluation, but by making this plan, it helps you as their supervisor who will be evaluating them know what that's going to look like and have a plan for that. And the other thing is that the learning contract in itself is a real world practice opportunity. So as social workers, we need to be good at setting goals. This is a regular part of many of our practice, whether this is kind of a client treatment plan, whether this is a strategic plan for an organization. It is common in social work that we need to be able to kind of look at a larger situation and set some goals and benchmarks. And so really helping your students to recognize, like, we're not just doing this because it is an assignment and it has to be done, But the learning contract in itself is an opportunity for the student to kind of look at the big picture, engage with your organization, assess their own goals, and kind of come up with clear goals that they can measure. And so again, this is a practice opportunity in and of itself. I tell students that a lot, but that's a great thing for you to kind of reinforce too, and maybe connect to ways that goal setting occurs in your agency as well. So here I have, again, this kind of Venn diagram of looking at, so we have the students' goals and interests. What are they kind of coming into with? You have your agency's context and needs, and then we have the educational requirements. And so most of the things on the learning contract really should fit kind of in the intersection of these three things. And so by creating this learning contract, we're going to kind of help enhance the overall quality of the placement. Working to meet that, again, that intersection of these three things, it really helps with both principles of adult learning best practices and trauma-informed supervision principles in kind of giving room for choice to the student. So you have needs at your agency. And again, the student is coming in as an adult learner who wants to have kind of some choice and some influence over what it is that they are doing. But also it needs to fit within what it is that your agency is doing. So there might be something that your student is really interested in, but that's just not what your agency does. So that's not going to be a great fit, at least for very much of their practice. You know, if there's something they're really interested in, and you know, you might be able to allow them to spend some time doing a training and kind of talking about it, but not a lot of their time should be spent on something that doesn't fit in the context of your agency. But similarly, you know, again, ideally in the interview process, we've been able to ensure that what your agency does is at least somewhat in line with the student's goals and interests. And so kind of finding some things, there are certainly maybe things that you need them to do that, you know, might not perfectly align with their interests. So again, there's kind of space to pull these together. And then of course we have, you know, the educational requirements. What is it that we need students to do? So we're really kind of going through this plan helps us make sure that we're taking all of these things into account. So again, there are these 9 core competencies set by the CSWE, and I'm going to go through each of them in a little bit more detail. A couple things to know about those competencies. You know, one, like I said, this may or may not be the same. You know, if you went to school to be a social worker, and I know we've got both our social work field instructors and some of our site supervisors here, they may have changed since you were in school. They've certainly changed since I was in school. So these may not be the ones that you were most familiar with, but this is what we're working with now. Again, they don't change dramatically, but we'll go over each of them. The competencies themselves are the same for all levels of internship. So whether you're working with a BSW or an MSW generalist or advanced student, the competencies themselves are the same. However, the competencies are broken down a little bit further by practice behaviors, which again, I'll kind of go through that as well. Those practice behaviors vary whether you have an advanced level MSW student or whether you have a BSW or generalist student. So those BSW foundation level students, typically the students that are starting their internships in October, so we're kind of gearing up for them, they will have a different set than our advanced students who are already in internship now. So again, this kind of big picture of the learning contract structure, we have these 9 competencies. An example here, you know, competency 1 is that students will demonstrate ethical and professional behavior. Big, broad language there. Then that gets broken down into a number of practice behaviors. I just have one here as our example. So one example of practice behavior here is using supervision and consultation to guide professional judgment and behavior. And then the learning activity, this is the piece that the student is going to create. So the template for the learning contract starts with the competency and the practice behavior. And so an example of a learning activity that a student might put in their learning contract to meet this one is I will use supervision to present and reflect on one ethically challenging case per week. So this is a clear thing that they're going to do. You would be able to see that they did it. They would engage in this conversation in supervision. It would allow you to kind of get a sense of what the student was doing, how they were growing their competency in this area. So we're going to, again, talk just a little bit about each of these competencies here. So what I want to talk about in regard to the competencies is really kind of what does it mean to have competence in these areas? The competencies, again, are really broad language. This is, intentional because social workers work in a lot of different settings. You all work in a lot of different settings. And so these competencies are really broad language so that they can be tailored to fit in all of these different settings, and they are skills that are, can be translated into different scenarios. And so I've got a number of bullet points that I'll kind of talk a little bit about here, things that a student might be able to do. If they are competent in ethical and professional behavior, they would probably be able to demonstrate a good understanding of confidentiality. They would be able to learn and practice navigating dual relationships. They would get more comfortable kind of using some frameworks to make ethical decisions. They would have this ability to reflect on their emotions and how they're regulating that. They would demonstrate good time management. That one can be a real challenge. This is a great area to work on. They would be able to ask for help and accept feedback. Communication skills are, again, a really critical one that fall into here. We also talk a lot about ethical technology use, which is changing all of the time. How do we or don't we work with social media or generative AI? What does this look like ethically, and how are they able to demonstrate some competence in this? There are others. And so as I go through each of these competencies, I encourage any of you to add your own ideas and thoughts in the chat to help others and get us brainstorming. Like, when you're thinking about a student being competent in these areas, what are things that kind of stand out to you that you were looking for? So we'll move on to competency 2. So this is our advancing human rights and social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. So things that this might look like, really kind of recognizing some of these systemic challenges. So, how is society impacting individuals? Obviously, our individual clients are coming to us with challenges, but being able to recognize some of these larger systemic barriers. Are there places for them to advocate? Are they aware of good strategies? Sometimes our students with advocacy, sometimes they come on too strong, sometimes they're afraid to advocate and they don't come on strong enough. So kind of helping them learn to navigate that. And really just that ability to kind of think critically about some injustices that are out there, recognizing barriers, and how do we not just kind of, this is a good area for us to kind of move through that micro, meso, macro. How do we look at a micro challenge that somebody is having on that larger macro scale? Competency 3 is engage anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice. I want to kind of start by acknowledging that this language obviously has become hot button language. There are settings right now that you might have been told you can't do certain things that have these terms on them. This was something we talked through with students a lot last year. But what I really want to kind of emphasize is that even if you have programs, DEI programs that have been cut or that you aren't able to do, this is still something that we are doing as social workers. We are still looking at ways that we are recognizing clients' cultures. We are looking at where things are and aren't serving our clients. And so how are we able to adapt interventions based on individuals? How are we able to respect and explore difference? How are we, pulling cultural humility into our own practice and recognizing clients as experts on their own experiences and cultures, engaging with aspects of diversity that can be uncomfortable, even just kind of looking critically at current events that are happening around us. So again, all areas that even if there are limitations on, what your agency is doing and what it is being called, this is certainly still an area that students can be engaging in, they can be exploring, they can be having conversations and supervision. But really, doing things like looking at how agency practices can be inclusive of the different people you're serving, or looking at, who are we not serving and why? These are all sorts of things that students might be doing to engage in this competency. Competency 4 is our looking at our practice-informed research and research-informed practice. So kind of going both directions with that. And this is, students' ability to kind of think critically about the research that they're reading. Are they able to bring an article into supervision and talk about, how this would or wouldn't work in your setting? Are they able to develop some research questions? Again, depending on the level of your student, if you have an advanced level student, they'll be engaging in an evaluative research practice in the spring. So they might be doing this on a higher level. Our foundation and BSW students still have the ability to kind of be thinking critically about research and how it is impacting our practice, or what we're learning about our practice that might inform the broader research. How are they able to, elicit and review client feedback, getting feedback from clients and recognizing, like, how do we perhaps need to consider our practices based on what clients are experiencing. Competency 5, looking at our policy practice. So this can happen really broadly. So this can be looking at how local, state, or federal policies are impacting our clients. If you are in West Virginia, certainly we have the legislative session in the springtime. Wherever you may be, they might be able to kind of track a policy through the session and look at how it might impact your organization or your clients. This is also a space for them to look, more critically at agency policies. So what policies does your setting have? Are there policies that need to be revised? Can they do kind of an audit of different policies that your agency has and make some recommendations? Could they draft an agency policy? So really, this is a space to kind of look and see, whether our own policies internally or broad policies, how are policies impacting our clients, the employees that they're working with, how is it impacting our practice? Next, looking at competency 6, and I think the thing that's important for all of our competencies, but especially these next 6, 7, 8, 9, where we look at these client systems. So individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities. You may be in a setting where you're doing micro work and you're working with individuals. You may be in a setting where you're working more broadly with, community organizations or partners. And so this can be taken on a broad approach, what this word client means, but really this ability to engage. So are our students, are they able to get comfortable with client interaction? One of the things we say to students a lot is part of social work is learning how to get comfortable in uncomfortable situations. Are they able to get in there and engage, even if it's uncomfortable sometimes? Do they have different strategies they can use to develop rapport, especially if there are some clients that are maybe more challenging to develop rapport with? Do they have strategies for engaging with groups? One of the things, especially for our earlier students, is just this ability to kind of gain confidence in engagement as a professional. Are they seeing themselves in that professional light? Are they able to engage appropriately with professionalism and recognize themselves as a practitioner? So that's kind of that engagement piece. And then we move on into assessment. So again, looking broadly at whatever our client system is, but are they able to kind of understand connections between assessments and interventions? Can they think critically about the assessment tools that we use? Are they working? Are they not working? Are there questions that they have about them? They can be coming and thinking about how different theories might impact the assessments and the outcomes. This is also this space again to kind of learn from clients. What are they taking away from their clients? Are they able to adapt their practice based on what feedback they're getting from clients? This is a good space to look to at, respecting client self-determination. You can assess that there's a need for something, but if the client doesn't want to address that need, then maybe that's not what you're going to do. And that can be really hard for many of us as practitioners, but that's especially kind of a challenging one for our students to kind of recognize. Like sometimes we might recognize what's needed, but that's not what the client wants. And how do we kind of discuss that in supervision and learn to be okay with that? Competency 8, so here's our interventions. And so again, interventions are going to look different at different settings, but really to think about like what are the interventions that your setting offers? If this is maybe a more traditional setting where you are offering, counseling or case management, that might seem more straightforward. If you are a food pantry, your intervention might be getting people food. So again, your intervention can look a lot of different ways, but really thinking about, what are the interventions? How do different people in the organization use different interventions? This is a great one for multidisciplinary settings for students to kind of look at like, what do interventions look like if they come from a social worker versus a counselor or somebody with a different educational background. This is another one around this ability to set goals. So this connects really nicely with the learning contract itself. How do they kind of work through that goal setting process and figuring out what is the appropriate intervention? Another space where respecting client determination and individuality in goal setting is really important. Again, this can be really challenging if we think that there's an important goal for a client and that's not what they want for themselves. So learning to kind of recognize that. Also, this recognition that interventions don't always work, and that doesn't necessarily mean it was the wrong intervention. It just might not have been the one that was going to work at that moment. And so, again, getting more comfortable with some of these experiences. These are great areas for students to kind of think critically about. How do they work collaboratively? And this, again, can be with clients. This can be with other professionals. Just developing that ability to work collaboratively, with people from other agencies, whatever this looks like in your setting again. And then finally, our competency 9. So this is our evaluation. And so, again, this can happen a lot with our client systems, but this is also a good one to kind of turn internal. So students can be evaluating their own practice. They obviously will do an evaluation of themselves, but they can evaluate themselves. They can evaluate their experience at the internship. They can evaluate the internship itself. Sometimes a really good one here is to have the students kind of put together some sort of guide for a future intern, and they can throughout the year evaluate what experience they're having, and how they might be able to, come up with some ways to improve it for a future student. So they might be able to turn that one internally. Again, our advanced level students in the spring semester, they take their Research 616 course where they're all going to do an evaluation project. So we have kind of a built-in, one of their activities is built into their learning contract if they're an advanced student and how they're going to do that. But really, again, just spaces for them to evaluate what is happening, what is effective, what sort of tools do we use, what does success look like in your setting, and how do we evaluate that? How cultural differences might impact outcomes. These are all great things for them to consider. So that's my quick run through of, what our 9 competencies are. And again, I encourage you just to kind of keep thinking about these and like, what do you think it means to be competent in these different areas? So next, kind of looking at, what is the supervisor's role in goal setting? And so I have these kind of broken down into 3 buckets because you're playing a lot of different roles. And, many of you have seen my overview supervision training where I kind of talk about our supervision has these three areas of our administrative supervision, our supportive supervision, and our educational supervision. And so these are kind of in line with that. But really, you have this role as an educator where you are trying to encourage the students to develop this idea brainstorm. So really pushing the students to think, what is it that they want to do? Where is their curiosity going to take them? How can they be thinking about what are they learning in the classroom and what they're seeing in your agency and kind of coming up with this idea? What do they want to do? Then really pushing them again to help connect social work perspectives and theories and goals to practice. So encouraging them to come into supervision, what different theories have they learned about? How are they seeing these connections? Are there areas where they might, like to explore a certain theory more in how it connects? And then really, again, creating that supportive and structured environment there so that they do feel that they can bring new ideas, that they can have questions. And so this is that kind of bucket. As a mentor, you are going to help your student orient to the setting and understand what the agency's goals are. Again, they might come in with a lot of their ideas, but they need to understand how those ideas do or don't fit with what your overall agency's goals is so that they're working in alignment with what your needs are. You want to explore the student's professional and educational goals. So what are the things that they're hoping to accomplish? And then helping them to understand how the different experiences that they can have at your specific agency will kind of align with that. Similarly, helping them to connect this goal setting to professional practice context. So this is what I was talking about, that, the learning contract, while it is an assignment that we need to do, it is also an opportunity to practice in context. This is like practicing goal setting, practicing treatment planning, strategic planning, etc. And so helping them kind of connect this to other forms of practice they might do. And then you're going to have the role of an evaluator, where you're going to ultimately use this plan to help evaluate them. And so you want to set some boundaries around goals that may not be realistic to your setting. So if your student has different ideas and that just isn't aligned with what your agency is going to do, or you might think it's maybe too big and broad of a goal and it's not going to work. So helping kind of set boundaries. I think a flip side of this, as we talked about, that when we work with clients on setting goals, sometimes there might be unrealistic goals. You could also choose to let your student go down a path. Maybe we do set an unrealistic goal, and we talk about that throughout the internship, and we can change things if need be. So just to kind of be aware of that, and that knowing that you are there and can set boundaries around what goals do and don't fit in your setting. And then again, just kind of encouraging their ongoing self-assessment and their curiosity, because that will really continue to drive interest. We really see confidence and competence kind of go up hand in hand. So encouraging the space for curiosity and self-assessment will really help them grow. So talking a little bit about our learning contract goals, what is going to make a good goal? So I've got our SMART acronym here, and to talk about it in context of our learning contract. So the specific one is important. I think this is one that students struggle with the most, partly because as we've looked at, these competencies are really broad language. The practice behaviors sometimes are really broad language. And sometimes I see students kind of like reframing the practice behavior, and it's not very specific, and I'm not sure that they know what exactly it is that they're saying they're going to do. So these learning activities that they write in, they should be pretty specific. It should be pretty obvious what it is that they're going to do with that goal that they've made. This measurable one, I want to talk about what this means here. We want whatever it is that they say that they're going to do to be observable. We want this to be something that you are going to be able to evaluate. So not just did they do it or not, but is it something that you are going to be able to watch while they do this? You are going to be able to observe them growing in competence. Some things they might have to do a couple times and you'll feel pretty comfortable with their competence. Some things they might need to do lots of times and you might have a lot of conversation and supervision. Like, here's what we learned, here's how we're going to do this again. So this measurable piece, we want everything in their learning contract to be something that you can observe and see them do. Sometimes they might put a numeric number on it. I'm going to do 2 psychosocial assessments, and that's fine. But you might find after they've done 2 psychosocial assessments that they still have a lot to learn and you want them to do more. So again, that measurable, there's room for interpreting that different ways, but it should be something that you are able to use to evaluate. This achievable, this kind of goes into this, realistic. We want this to be something that you think that they are likely to have the opportunity to do. If it's out of the realm of what your organization is going to do, that doesn't really make sense. And that relevant kind of goes along there as well, that these generally should be relevant both to our social work learning outcomes and also what your agency is doing. So you're not the setting for them to go do something that has nothing to do with the agency. So really making sure that these goals that they set fit within the context of your organization. The T here for time bound, I will just say that all of these goals are going to happen within the context of the internship. We don't require that they put a more specific time frame on there than that. So they don't necessarily need to talk about the time frame in there, just knowing that this will happen during the internship. If they want to designate, I'm going to really work on this during the first semester of my internship, that's fine. But just kind of saying in that time bound piece, we're less specific because we already are time bound within the internship is a finite period of time. One thing I will mention for those of you that are supervising our BSW students or our generalists, and so again, those are the students that are in the shorter internships, the 300 or 400-hour internships, their learning contract uses a drop-down menu for kind of the piece that makes it measurable, observable. So I'll talk a little bit more and show you what that looks like, but they will have kind of some choices they can use to help make that a little bit easier, whereas our advanced level students, we want them to have more practice doing that part independently. So they'll be writing out the whole thing without that drop down. So things to consider and what makes a good learning contract goal. So a few tips are we want them to personalize their activities. So, these ideally should use first person language. A lot of them are going to start with I will. These are action statements, the things that your students are going to do. They should be tailored to a specific issue, your specific setting. We have sample activities and now there's a link to that in this presentation. The students are welcome to use the sample activities as a starting point, but they do need to tailor them to the space, to the specific setting. There's one, for example, that says something along the lines of like, I will explore a current event and how it's relevant to my client population. We don't want them to just say that in the learning contract. They could kind of narrow that down, what sort of current event we're talking about and what sort of population. So again, they're going to make that a little bit more specific to what it is that they are doing. That verification. So again, do we want there to be some way that you are seeing this happen so that you have the opportunity to observe them and evaluate them? And so there's common ones that we use. This is not an exhaustive list. And I mentioned that our foundation BSW level students have a drop down. The options that we include in the dropdown are these 4 that I have listed here. So they might say that they're going to do something and discuss it in supervision. It's okay to use that a lot. You don't have to be the only thing, but it's fine if that is something that they use frequently. This helps them kind of plan their agenda for supervision. It allows you to kind of bring a lot of that educational component into supervision for them to go have an experience, bring it back into supervision and talk about it. Other things they might do: develop a written document. This can be, ideally something usable. Can they make a report? Can they make a fact sheet? Can they make a brochure? Can they leave something there that will be useful for your agency that also allows you to see their learning process? Maybe they're going to develop some sort of written reflection that documents, what they're thinking and experiencing. You can assign them additional things like this too. You might have them do a process recording, a genogram, a critical case incident, whatever you want that to look like. So some sort of written reflective process might be another one that they do. And then finally, kind of attending or participating in a specific event that can be observable in itself. So if they're going to go and be somewhere, that's something that's observable. They still might bring that back into supervision and talk about. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. The students that use the drop-down menu, they have these four, and then there's also an open text, so they can put other things in there as well. But whatever level of student you have, there should be some kind of verification method so that you have the opportunity to see what it is that they did and evaluate them on it. I will also mention that there are a few required activities. We'll look briefly at the learning contract template. There are a few things that are kind of already built into the learning contract. So for those, we ask the students to add 2 activities in each area. Some of them already have one built in, so they would just be adding one more. Other kind of tips to think through. As I said, in looking at the competencies, we want to keep in mind that the client can be individual, family, group, organization, community. So that context of a client can be broad. This is kind of, this art of not being too vague and not being too specific. We don't want them to write themselves into a corner where they're like, I'm going to go to a CBT training on December 12th. Maybe we can be not quite so specific. We're going to go to a training. Maybe we're going to go to a CBT training, but, we can be specific enough that we know what we're talking about, but not so vague that like, that training got canceled. We're going to do something else. So that kind of finding that happy balance there. Trying to get them not to just repeat the language from the practice behavior. Again, this is one that I see a lot where it seems like they've just kind of like rephrased the practice behavior. My read on that as an instructor is that they don't really understand it. They weren't able to kind of put it into an activity, and so they just kind of said it again. So it should be, again, that's specific. It should be specific what they're actually going to do. It should be a plan to demonstrate competency, not exactly what will be evaluated. And so again, this is us thinking ahead to the evaluation, but the learning contract truly is not meant to be a checklist. And so it's not so much when you are going to evaluate them that you're going to be like, yes, they did this 2 times. They are excellent because they did what they said they're going to do. You really want to say like, okay, I saw them do this 2 times. Here's the level of competence I saw from them doing. You can have those conversations about them. So again, just making sure as they are setting those goals that you feel like the things that they're going to be engaging in will give you space to evaluate their level of competence, not just whether or not they did it. And then also just kind of emphasizing that the learning contract doesn't limit them from doing other things. So the learning contract is a starting point, it is a plan, but as we all know, things are changing and shifting all the time. There might be opportunities that come up, so they are welcome to do additional things than are on their learning contract. That just kind of gives us that starting point and plan. So I have a couple examples that we'll look through. Starting with this, kind of making this connection that our competency language is kind of like a goal. Our practice behavior, and so these are given to us. The competency is the goal. So competency 2 is advanced human rights and social, racial, and economic and environmental justice. Then we have our practice behavior similar to an objective. And so one of the practice behaviors here is engage in practices that advance human rights to promote social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. Then they're going to come up with their learning activity. I make this to me seems similar to an intervention if you were kind of doing a treatment plan. So here, an example would be, I will create a presentation on ways to expand inclusivity within my agency and share with the leadership team. So it's a very specific thing that they're going to do. We can see how it connects to, advancing human rights and promoting, the different types of justice. And then there's this way that they're going to make this verifiable. They're going to share it with the leadership team, which would give you the opportunity to see what they came up with and evaluate them on it. So this is an example of a good goal that fits there. Here we have kind of some examples of stronger goals and not so strong goals. So for that same, kind of going back here, for the same competency and practice behavior, kind of a weak goal would be, I will learn about social justice and human rights during my internship. Of course, we want them to do that, but that's not very specific. It's not super easy to evaluate, how well did that happen? So a stronger goal here would be to say, like, I will co-facilitate at least 2 client advocacy meetings, focus on access to housing or food security, right? I will reflect with my supervisor how these actions align with principles of racial and economic justice. So again, we have a specific thing, it's fitting in a specific setting. They're bringing this into looking at kind of the first 1 to 3 weeks of internship for those. So for those of you with advanced students that start at the beginning of the semester, we're kind of in this period of time right now. Students are getting oriented to the agency, encouraging them to be really developing like a brainstorm list of possible activities, encouraging them to think about like what are things that they've done, what have they seen others do, what do they want to do, what are some of their goals, and just make a big list like that. And then through weeks 3 and 4, they can start to turn that list into some goals and draft that into Tavera. They can discuss this with their supervisor and incorporate feedback, and then they're going to submit it to their seminar instructor, their field faculty liaison, and get feedback from us. During that week 5 through 6, we are going to review the learning contract. So the liaison will review the learning contract. We generally have some requests and some edits we want them to make, send it back to the students so that they can incorporate that feedback with their supervisors and then resubmit. And then it kind of moves forward through the signature process. I was planning to show you all the signature process on Tavera, but I'm running short on time. So I'm going to make a quick video and I will send that in an email so that you can kind of see that walkthrough and see the visual of what that looks like. So I will get that out for you all shortly so you have that as a resource. So again, just kind of really quickly as we're finishing, kind of clarifying roles. So the student is the author of this document. They should be the one generating a list of goals. They should be managing the deadlines, completing these revisions, and asking for help as they need so that they are kind of driving this process. As the supervisor, you are there to be kind of advisor of the process, provide overview of the agency's goals and how the intern kind of fits into that and how their activities fit into that. Giving any kind of reality checks about maybe unrealistic ideas, providing guidelines on how the tasks might fit into the competencies, and helping them see this parallel between their own goal setting process and kind of broader social work goal setting process. Then we, as the faculty field liaisons to whoever is the student seminar instructor, we're in there as a teacher. We're providing instructions. We're helping the students kind of understand the larger context of the document. We spend a lot of time reviewing the competencies as well. And then we review the draft and provide feedback. So again, I'm going to skip this demonstration, but I will send you a video of this. And like to kind of, as we move this forward, thinking about how we use this learning contract once it is complete. So I really encourage the student to print a copy, use this in supervision, reference this. This ideally isn't something that we create and then don't look at again until it's time to evaluate, but really kind of build it into supervision on a regular basis. Students sometimes might write in timing of their different activities. They can add in other activities as they go. So these are some ways you might be able to use the contract kind of moving forward through supervision. And then again, that this plan is to help us look ahead to assessment. So, starting off with a strong learning contract helps us assess the student's performance. If we're able to incorporate that into our ongoing supervision, it will help us provide good assessment feedback. And that's something that when you're completing those midterm and final assessments, you'll be able to kind of look back to those activities. So again, having strong activities really helps us to be able to demonstrate that level of competence when we go to the assessment. I've got a few resource slides on here. And so again, I sent this presentation out so you have these links. We do have a document with some sample learning activities. There's also a field guidance packet that we have that has a section on remote learning activities. So if your student is going to be doing some things remote, there's some ideas. And then we have a general training video page on our website. There are student videos about developing the learning contract on there. And then finally, I have this evaluation. If you have time to do it now, I would appreciate it. If not, I will also send this link out. Housekeeping things, if you requested CEs, we'll get those processed in the next 1 to 2 weeks. So yes, please fill out the evaluation if you can. I know we ran really close on time. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. And otherwise, again, I really appreciate your time and bearing with me the first time we've ran this training in particular.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.